All right, well, let's try to get started here. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome to our session today that will be bilingual. We'll try to have a full hour of bilingual conversation. So I'm grateful to our three panelists here today who are going to make sure that we are faithful to that for the hour that we're gathered here. Just a little bit of a reminder to everybody who's joining us, if you're on our Zoom webinar, go ahead and look at the bottom of your screen if you're on the desktop, and you'll see that there's a chat button. That's go ahead and click on that, and that's where you can see everybody chatting to one another, letting each other know where they're from, and saying hello, and we can keep that chat alive and vibrant for the whole hour that we're together. If you have a specific question that you want to make sure that we address, there's also a Q&A feature, so click on that button. Oh, ¿qué tal, Pedro? So go ahead and click on the Q&A button and ask your specific questions there so that it helps us to see them a little more clearly. We'll try to address them in the context of the hour. Peter, can you reiterate a little bit en español, por favor?
Sure. Vamos a hacer esto bilingüe, de forma bilingüe, un poquito de español, un poquito de inglés, un poquito de Spanglish, y nada más para que todos que están participando y viendo esto, que al pie de la pantalla, ahí se encuentra el feature de chat, y ahí se puede comunicar con los demás. Asegúrense de que está en all panelists y participantes, porque si no, no todos van a ver lo que están escribiendo. También podemos usar este chat para comunicar con nosotros que estamos presentando, para recordarnos, por favor, repiten esto en español. Or use the chat feature if we're talking in Spanish, for example, and the conversation is going on, and you want to have it reiterated. Just remind us, hey, you all, can you repeat it in English as well? Just so that we're attentive to it. Sometimes the conversations get very passionate and can get rolling along, so we might forget to make sure that it's understandable for all. Y si tienen una pregunta, use el feature de Q&A, and that will allow us to actually entertain any of the questions. So si tienen pregunta, usen eso para preguntar algo a nosotros directamente para que podamos responder a su pregunta. Okay. Con eso dicho, why don't we have our panelists introduce themselves? So you all know me. I'm Peter Kolar. I'm the editor of Spanish and Bilingual Resources here at GIA Publications. And again, we're very grateful for GIA for hosting this and for offering this wonderful content. Tenemos el privilegio de tener con nosotros Andrea Ramos y Damaris Thillet, amigas muy buenas conmigo. He conocido a ellos muchos años y hemos trabajado juntos en varios esfuerzos. Realmente es un orgullo, un privilegio tenerlas con nosotros. Así con eso dicho, Andrea y luego Damaris, por favor, si presenten a ustedes a todo el grupo.
Muchas gracias, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kate. Thanks, GIA, for having us today. Mi nombre es Andrea Ramos, como lo dijo Peter. Yo soy la directora de música para la diócesis de Austin, Texas. Soy boliviana de nacimiento. Vine a los Estados Unidos hace 13 años. Y estuve trabajando en ministerio en la diócesis de Little Rock, Arkansas, por varios años, y después ya en Austin, Texas, ya llevo trabajando a nivel diocesano los últimos 7 años. My name is Andrea Ramos, and I am the music director for the Diocese of Austin, Texas. I am from Bolivia. I moved to the United States 13 years ago. I ministered for the Diocese of Little Rock, Arkansas for about 5 years, and then moved to Texas, and I've been working at the diocesan level for the past 7 years.
Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Damaris Thillet y sirvo en la Arquidiócesis de Santa Fe como directora de la Oficina de Liturgia. Para mí es un honor, una bendición estar aquí, conectarme con ustedes. Gracias a Peter por la invitación y a GIA. Bueno, soy oriunda de Puerto Rico, original de Puerto Rico, y llegué a este país cuando apenas tenía 16 años, a Filadelfia. Feliz de haber llegado a este país que me ha dado tanto también. Y entonces estamos aquí para compartir en esta tarde. Gracias. My name is Damaris. I'm sorry I didn't say that in English. I am the director of the Office of Worship at the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. I came from Puerto Rico when I was 16 to Philadelphia, to the East Coast. So I have been working for the church all my life. It has been a blessing. And I'm here to serve. I'm here to be part of this wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much for being here with us. Of course, it's an honor to work with my colleague, Peter Kolar, day in and day out. And I'm so glad to be on this journey with all of you. I thought it would be good to give us a little bit of situational perspective here. So talking a little bit about our particular upbringings in this church. And I know that there's a lot of language going back and forth, and we wanted to set that off right from the beginning, because this is really the pace of language and of navigating communication that is really a true representation of what it means to be a minister in the church. And so I will also be going back and watching this when we premiere it on Facebook Live as well, because there's a lot here, and we need time to learn how to keep up with the pace of our representation of the body of Christ here. But to give people a little bit of background about the perspectives that we're bringing to the conversation, in addition to letting people know where we live now and where we're from. So just a little bit of storytelling. For me, my story starts, I'm from Northwest Iowa, but we went to church in Southwest Minnesota, a parish called St. Mary's in Worthington, Minnesota, which was a vibrant, bilingual, multicultural community. And that was a little bit of it stood out, I think, from its rural context, in that you would be perfectly, you would assume that, there's a lot of white people who speak English, and that is the landscape of Northwest Iowa. But the truth is that there was actually quite a growing and booming and beautiful Spanish-speaking community, and their place to church was St. Mary's in Worthington. And so that's where I grew up, in a bilingual community. That's always been my context, is to be worshiping in a bilingual community. And even though I am far from fluent in my Spanish speaking, that's always been a reality for me to learn. I was learning church and learning liturgy alongside learning Spanish and learning how communities kind of intersect. That's where I was first a music minister. My very first position as an accompanist was for the Coro Hispano at St. Mary's, and that began when I was 14 years old. So I really didn't understand liturgy or anything. I have this distinct memory of playing, turning too many pages in my book and accidentally playing an Alleluia when I should have been playing the Gloria, and the very kind nun turning my pages back. Oh, we're here now. So a lot of baptism by fire and a lot of learning in the moment has been a reality for me. And when I came to GIA, I knew that GIA as a company had a lot of homework to do, a lot of ground to make up for in what we were able to offer to a bilingual church and to a Spanish-speaking church. And so one of the very first things I did was hired my colleague Peter Kolar, in a little bit of a coup, but we brought them all over eventually too. So Peter, why don't you tell us a little bit about your context too?
Yeah, it's tremendous, Kate. Y nada más para recordar que vamos a manejar esto de manera bilingüe. So if you're a non-Spanish speaker, and some of this is a little bit of a struggle to understand, it's a great challenge. I grew up not speaking Spanish. I'm not a native speaker. even though both my parents spoke Spanish, my mom is a native of El Salvador, my dad is Polish American, and he's full out gringo, but spoke Spanish. That's how they met in El Salvador. He was a Marine embassy guard, and they met in El Salvador, and they got married and moved back here to the States. So Spanish for me growing up was the language that my parents would use to keep the kids from knowing what they were saying. And so that was kind of the motivation there to say, well, I want to understand what my parents are saying. And so I was surrounded by it. I knew what Spanish pronunciation was. I would hear my mom on the phone all the time talking por horas, with my tia, and that was very much, part of who I was. I got those little glimpses of it, but I want to discover more. So this was an impetus for me to discover this part of my heritage and to immerse myself more in it. And as it turned out, then I had the opportunity after I came to college in Chicago to stay in Chicago and work in a primarily Mexican and Mexican American community called the Back of the Yards. Shout out to Back of the Yards, Chicago, South Side. And in that environment is where I really was just immersed, both in the language. I was directing Spanish choirs. I was directing a children's choir, parents, of course, of whom did not speak English. And so my being thrust into the deep end of having to learn the language well, even though I had been exposed to it and knew vocabulary and studied language in college and in high school and studied Spanish, but it's different than actually speaking it. So I understand your challenge. Todavía batallo mucho hablar bien español. Y gracias a mis amigas aquí para corregirme en estilo muy suavemente y entendible para que yo siempre esté mejorando también en ese aspecto. So being immersed in this community is where I was first baptized into Hispanic liturgical music. And it was a wondrous experience. I lived a good almost 15 years in Chicago. I lived and worked right there in the neighborhood. It's an immigrant community, very poor, ridden by poverty, violence, drugs, gangs. That was just the reality of where we lived. You would look at this neighborhood, and even Chicago still looks at this kind of a black sheep, of a neighborhood, of that, it's not a neighborhood that people want to go to. They stay away from it, Back of the Yards, and those surrounding areas. And yet that was not my experience there. My experience was one of a vibrant community of faith. And the church, being this, Holy Cross was the name of the church, and being a central focal point of the neighborhood, not just visually as it was this, enormous, impressive structure, but really it was the center of life in the neighborhood. Everything revolved around it. And I worked with the youth, and I mean, it was a young neighborhood. It was just like sprawling with vibrancy and life and just all kinds of expressions of this faith. And so I saw a devout people there that in the face of all this downtroddenness and what you would imagine as bleakness, they found life and they lived it and professed it. So I could tell you many, many more stories about that experience. I will share one. As the parish was run by Claretians, and at the time the pastor also directed one of the choirs, and he was from Spain, era español. And he was a very eccentric conductor. He didn't conduct to the beat or anything. It was very impossible to follow. But I remember his choir was made up of what we called the Itas, because it was Melita, Carmelita, Carmencita, and Conchita. So they were all the Itas that made up the choir, the Viejitas. And it was wonderful. And so I came in as the accompanist, and I'm not a guitarist. I've studied piano, so I'm a keyboardist. And so I came in to accompany their choir on the organ. So my first experience with Hispanic liturgical music was not guitar or percussion or the kind of things that you would normally associate with. It was organ, and I had to accompany this choir. And there was, they would have some of the music written. A lot of it was written, and he was from Spain, and so he brought a lot of the music of Gavarain, Alazon, Erdosain, a lot of these Spanish composers with this great, canon of wonderful liturgical works. And some of it was written out, and others were not. And sometimes I would simply get a lyric sheet with chords, and not even, English chords. They were the solfeo chords. So I had to, learn that very rapidly as well. And it was not the movable solfege that we were studying in sight singing. It was the fixed solfege system. And I would say, well, do you have the music to this? And they would say, well, ahí está la música. And I was like, well, these are just the words. How does it go? Luckily, I play by ear. I grew up playing polkas and glomming onto melodies really quickly. So it was not a problem to do that. But I look back at those experiences with some wonder now and awe and also lots of gratitude. So I live now in El Paso, Texas. I've been living here for close to 15 years, and hope many more experiences I could share about being on the border. But that's the context of my journey that I wanted to share in this group.
Yeah, awesome. Damaris.
Yes, my journey has been a little similar to Peter, but different in a different way, because when I came to this country, I didn't speak any English at all. And I brought my guitar. That's all I had, my guitar and my voice. and I grew up with no music notation in church. And I remember the religious, they used to teach us by listening and by repeating. And it was music from Gavarain. That's what I'm saying. We have a lot of similar things, Gavarain, Dosain. So, and I remember those moments. So when I came to the United States, I went to St. Veronica's parish in Philadelphia, I remember, and the pastor met Diego, my husband Diego, and myself, and I became the coordinator for that choir. And I remember my first experience with the bilingual community, bicultural community, was for the Triduum. It was for Easter Vigil. And it was quite a challenge. And it was the first time I experienced something like that, because I never experienced that in the island. So yeah, it was a challenge, and I remember those among many other experiences that gave me so much, I would say, kind of wisdom, to be able to keep walking in this journey and to walk with others. So that has been my little experience when I first came to this country.
Andrea?
Very similar to what Damaris and Peter have already shared. And like Damaris said, I relate so much to Peter's experience, but the other way, right? I was born and raised in Bolivia. I didn't move to the United States until I was in my 20s. So really, most of my life was spent down there. And of course, my experience of church down in Bolivia was very different than what it became here. In the sense that, like Damaris said, there's no music notation when you're singing at church. I mean, even as como un simple feligres, ¿no es cierto? Cuando vas a la misa, as a member of the assembly, what's a hymnal? That there, at least in Bolivia, that was not my experience. You don't even get a piece of paper as a participation aid. You just go, and I remember we would have the occasional projections if it was a new song or something that people were not very acquainted with, new music, and that was about it. And everything was learned by ear. Y hay mucha tradición oral, ¿no? Que se pasa de generación a generación. Things are not in a book, they're not in a hymnal, but rather, families. The dad passes it on to the son will pass it on to the next generation, or the friend to the other friend. And that's how music ministry is handled. Surprisingly, I was not very involved in music ministry actively when I was in Bolivia. I'm a musician. I was an active performer down there. And I just didn't find a whole lot of time to become involved with actual music ministry, besides maybe occasionally. Also, something very interesting that would happen was that oftentimes the ministers of the Mass, the music ministers, were a family. So it was almost like this family had these designated tasks. So it was really not open to, the rest of the community members. We know that they were assigned that particular ministry, and that was theirs to take care of, and that was their responsibility. And sometimes it was just one person. Choirs, that was not something that you would see very regularly, depending on which church you attended or what Mass. Sometimes it was just one person ministering. But we all sang. And again, it was all in my language, right? My experience of church there is that I belonged. Everybody looked like me. We all spoke the same language. Well, then I moved to the United States, and I moved to the state of Arkansas. So that was a very interesting experience for me too, because, the first time I attended Mass was at the cathedral in Little Rock. Beautiful church, and they really became my family. But the reality was that I will never forget the first time I attended Mass. I met this friend. Catholics are a minority down there. So it was very rare. I kept meeting people, but I wouldn't really meet Catholics. That was a first for me, because I was used to being in a country where everybody was a Catholic. All of a sudden, I'm in a place where not everybody's a Catholic. And that to me was very shocking. Finally, I met a friend. He's Catholic, and wow, we just clicked. I actually married him years later. And so he said, hey, I said, I haven't been to Mass. I don't even know where to go. I don't even know how to get there, because I had moved from La Paz, where I am from, a city of 2 million people, to a college town in Arkansas where there was not even public transportation. So even that was a challenge. I couldn't get to church. I didn't know how to. I didn't know where church was. I didn't know how to get there. So I meet my friend, and he says, yeah, I'm Catholic. And of course we just clicked, and we start sharing stories. And he says, hey, would you like to go to Mass? And I think, oh my gosh, yes, please. So he takes me to the cathedral in Little Rock, and it was just gorgeous. I remember being in awe, right? It's so beautiful. And of course we walk in, and it does look different than what I'm used to. But I remember my first experience was, the church is finally filled up. I hadn't paid too much attention, but we stood up for the procession, and I turned around and nobody looked like me. Mm. And I was thinking, wow, I've never felt this. And I remember even from grabbing the hymnal, opening the hymnal, that was also somewhat of a cultural shock for me, because I was thinking, I've never had a participation aid for church. But I really needed it at the same time, because I didn't know the music we were singing. I had never heard those hymns. I had never heard any of this music. So I remember opening my hymnal and thinking, wow, this is really cool. But at the same time, it feels so strange, right? I've never done this. This is so new. And we started singing the hymn, and I remember mispronouncing some words, and I would just catch myself giggling every now and then, because I'm thinking, yeah, I really don't know how to say that, but I don't know what just came out of my mouth, but the note was right. And it just felt like such a beautiful, but yet such a foreign experience to me, because everything was just ordered and done in a way that it was just not how I had, what I had been doing for the past 20-something years. And then I remember even for the spoken parts of the Mass, the Lord be with you. And I remember taking a breath, and I was ready to say, y con tu espíritu. And then as I hear around me, nobody's saying y con tu espíritu. And all of a sudden I realized, wow, I don't even know the words to this simple response in English. I didn't know it. So I remember it was one of the most beautiful experiences, just experiencing the Mass here in Arkansas, the music, just everything, how it was done. It was beautiful. I really enjoyed it. But at the same time, for the first time in my life, I had really felt as an outsider, as somebody that was just lost. I just had to follow people trying to figure out what they were doing, how they were doing it. And then I couldn't participate verbally, which to me was a first, because I didn't know the responses. I didn't know the Mass in English. So I didn't know simple things like, y con tu espíritu. I was not ready to answer that in English. So it was a very, very interesting road to just learning, the culture, but also learning church here, learning how to adapt. And what made it so interesting was that at the end of that Mass, of course, I met the music director, and he was very excited to hear that I was a voice student and that I was living there. So of course, he invited me immediately to join the ministry. And I said yes. I was very excited. I was like, yeah, I'll join this choir. It will be fun. But even then, I remember experiencing the first rehearsals. I didn't know what I was doing. I was a professional musician, so I knew how to follow a score. I knew what we were supposed to do musically. However, the language was a big barrier, and even the styles, right? Ya no estábamos cantando Gabaraín, no estábamos cantando Ordosaín. We were singing Palestrina, we were singing other things that, yes, I was able to, to follow along and sing the music. I was a musician myself, but I remember even the rehearsals, like it was such a shock because I couldn't really keep up with the conversation sometimes, or the instructions. English was not my first language at the time. When I came to the States, I was not fluent in English. I was not. I spoke English good enough to be admitted as a full-time student in college, but that didn't mean that I was actually fluent. So I remember having to ask my friends, and some of them were very patient and were very helpful in repeating or re-explaining something that would make sense to me, but not always. And one of the funny experiences, well, funny to me now, but at the time it was not so funny. I remember telling my friend, who, like I said, my now husband, how difficult it was for me to be serving as a minister in an English choir, but not being able to follow the Mass. Because I said, I sing, but when it's time for me to respond, to recite the Creed, the Our Father, I can't. I don't know the words. And he said, well, just do it in your language. We're all saying the same thing. Estamos hablando el mismo idioma. Las oraciones son las mismas. So he said, hazlo en español. So I did it. I started doing it. Until eventually somebody that used to sing next to me said, hey, you're really been distracting, because I hear something that doesn't sound like English, and then I start paying attention, and then I'm not paying attention to the Mass anymore. So they said, if you do it, could you please do it soft, so I don't have to hear it. And I don't think this person really had a bad intention when saying this. I really, truly don't think they realized what they were saying, because they also had never experienced this. They have never had somebody that did not speak their language in the group, that was not fully, acquainted with how things work. This was also new to them. So, of course, me, the new kid on the block, I thought, okay, I'm just gonna get quieter. I'm gonna try to pray softer when I do it in Spanish. But then, of course, that also creates a complex, right? So it immediately made me feel slightly, I don't know if inferior or just like I didn't belong. So I went ahead and I forced myself to learn the whole Mass in English. I forced myself to do it because I realized it was the only way to really feel like I blended, like I was able to do everything with everybody and like everybody. And, now looking back, of course, that's how, I just assimilated myself into the ways, this particular community and how they did things. But I also felt at the same time that I kind of left part of myself behind. No, dejé una parte de quién era yo, de mi identidad atrás, ¿no? Para forzarme a aprender la misa en inglés para poder participar, para poder servir como ministro. I remember even as a cantor having that complex of what if my accent is heard, right? What if I mispronounce a word? I just remember developing this slight paranoia, right? Of like, what if? So the only way was by assimilating myself to this, to this culture, to this community, to how they work. They became my family. I mean, I've had a wonderful time actually there. What I didn't realize is how that impacted me on the personal level, though. And I think that's when I moved to Texas. Of course, the picture was very different here. Much more diversity around me. I started hearing my language for the first time around me all the time. I didn't even know what to do with myself when that started happening. I remember telling my husband, I'm not used to it. Even when people talk to me in Spanish, I answer in English. How goofy is that? But it's because I'm not used to it. I'm not used to it. So, but all those things made me realize that, you know, maybe my experience would have been a little smoother if I would have been able to maybe start worshiping in my language at first. If I would have been able to see other people that looked like me, if I would have seen things that made me feel connected around me, you know, during worship, during the liturgies I attended. I'm very grateful for everything I've learned during my time in Arkansas, for everything that I've experienced with the community down there. But those things definitely raised a lot of questions in my head, and also drove me to want to be there for, you know, my Hispanic brothers and sisters, and just, you know, see how we can find ways for things not to be so shocking and so, you know, not make people feel like outsiders, but rather welcoming in the community. So that's about the summary of my experience and the transitions and everything that I have gone through.
Let's, no quiero perder la oportunidad de realmente aprovechar de la gran sabiduría que tienen ustedes. This session, you know, we can't lose this opportunity to tap into the great wisdom that everyone here, but Andrea and Damaris, with your experience, something for me that's an ongoing challenge, a part of my ministry, is a dual-fold or a dual-pronged approach to everything that I have to do. I have explained some of this in other sessions too, but being of mixed heritage, I feel sometimes on the fence with Anglo and Latino cultures. Sometimes I feel squarely on one side of the fence or the other. But I also feel like an obligation, I feel a special obligation to bring sides together. And I think in my position, certainly editorially, even to a certain extent here as a director of the Diocesan Choir in El Paso, and having concern for the music ministry landscape here locally. But I know that part of what I do is both education to my culture, I'm going to call the Latino culture, my Latino culture, in terms of sharing gifts, providing opportunities that traditionally have escaped them or not been provided. When you think of the great, you know, liturgical formation going on here, often Latinos are not privy to those opportunities. We're not thinking of, you know, upholding and fostering leadership from within the Latino community. And in turn, we often then suppress it. You know, and I now speak we from the other side of the fence, from the dominant culture side. And another aspect of what I feel responsible for is to then opening the doors, building the bridge, and compelling the dominant culture to take on some of that role then to build those bridges, to extend those opportunities to that have traditionally resided solely in one camp. And that takes breaking down a lot of systems. And yo creo que todo lo que ha pasado en este tiempo, la muerte de George Floyd, todo lo de COVID, en lo que estamos viviendo ahorita, that has brought to the forefront, I think, some more realization that we have a lot more work to do. And there's this ansiedad, there's this angst, this restlessness, we need to do more. Some of this has to do also with how we're treated by the dominant culture, we as Latinos. And I think it's intriguing, the parallel. We have our Black brothers and sisters who are crying out to be heard in the midst of suppression, underneath police brutality or other systematic racial oppression. But that fight seems sometimes over here, and the Latino struggle seems over here, and they're not necessarily united, even though they're both sometimes oppressed by the same systematic structures. And so I'm fascinated by, by how the times we're living call us to rise up to those challenges. And especially the reason we're having this conversation, la razón de que estamos aquí, hablando un poquito en español y con nuestros hermanos y hermanas hispanos, is to exactly explore those issues. And I want to hear from your voices in that. Both of you have worked at parish levels, han trabajado a nivel parroquial, pero ahora están ustedes en posiciones de que pueden afectar más cambios positivos at the diocesan level. And I know that takes energy both in this direction and sometimes fighting battles internally to have minds and hearts change, to be open to that very kind of change. So I'm putting that out there. I'm interested en sus reacciones y observaciones acerca de eso.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for sharing this and opening this conversation. In my case, coming from Puerto Rico with no English, with my accent, which I keep carrying all the time, I felt discrimination in so many ways, not just in the church, I would say in so many ways. I think we do feel that even among my own culture, Puerto Rican culture, I did experience my mom being discriminated because my mom is African, Puerto Rican. My grandpa he came from Ghana, so I experienced those situations so many times just for the way I look, because my accent, because I'm a woman. And I felt in so many cases, because this position or this specific leadership position was accustomed to be for a male position. Now it comes a woman, Latino woman with darker skin, and so I believe it was not intentional. I think it's more about lack of knowledge or experience, and to know each other, to be able to have that opportunity to know that person. Es muy importante el no asumir. We tend to assume by how you look, by how you sound, and we assume, and it's very sad to say this, but that has been such a tool for me to really grow and to embrace that in a positive way, that helped me to help others and to bring awareness and to walk with others, and to become a bridge, that bridge that you just mentioned. Ser un puente para traer, ¿verdad? Conciencia, para traer conciencia de lo que ha sucedido y ha sido por una experiencia personal, una vivencia, my own journey. It has been based on that. So I can talk about that. I can share that story. I strongly believe we don't share enough our stories. No compartimos suficiente nuestras historias. Esas historias se edifican y también se conectan. Our stories connect with others. And I do remember clearly that Easter Vigil I mentioned in the beginning. It was my first experience and my first encounter with another community, another culture, the dominant culture at that point. And I remember I received a paper as a music coordinator, and I was 16 years old and just highlighted it. Okay, the Amen, the Lamb of God, the 3 parts during the liturgy that would be for the Spanish choir. At the end, we didn't sing nothing because the English choir was in the choir loft and they didn't have the same paper we had. For them, they followed everything that was in the paper. And the coordinator was such a beautiful person. And that was my connection. She was so instrumental. We became together and we sat down and she said, how can we work on this? How can we make this different? Because the community was very upset to the point that the whole Hispanic community asked for a separate liturgy at that point. And the following year, we were separated for Easter Vigil, So during that year, I met with Miss Heggie. I will never forget her name. And we had different conversations, different dialogues and ways. How can we connect these 2 cultures? How can we work together? And that's how we were able to accomplish it. So I started visiting her choir rehearsals. She came to the Spanish choir rehearsals. So we worked together. And she was the one asking for me to be at that table when they were planning, when they were preparing the liturgy, because she said, someone is missing here. It's not just about bringing this paper and you highlighting what they're going to do. We need this conversation. So and it was not Miss Haggie's fault. That's why I'm saying it's not intentional. Sometimes it's a lack of knowledge and awareness, and it's the reality. But that was very challenging.
You bring up so many excellent points. It's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful image. Me encanta mucho la idea de que ese puente que estamos tratando de construir nos permite compartir dones. It's like there's so many gifts on either side that can be shared, but we often live in isolation of each other. And the very scenario that you brought up here is, of course, replicated in parishes throughout the country. How many times have we seen music director, de facto Anglo, in charge of a parish music ministry, yet that entire encompassing parish ministry doesn't include the coro hispano, who are just left in that corner, ahí en esa esquina, haciendo su propia cosa, dejando que hagan lo que quieren, pero sin ningún sentido de establecer una relación. So the gifts that could be shared, the instruction that they may be yearning for, and even recognition. Let's even before we get to instruction, let's get just to simple recognition. Is oftentimes lost simply because it's in isolation, and that isolation is often driven by fear. I don't want to engage because language barrier. They don't read music. I don't know how to do that. They play songs I've never heard of. Hacen su propia cosa. We'll just let them be. And then how does that purport to be a parish-wide music ministry when it's really just serving those of the dominant culture, and the Spanish choir is left over here by themselves? So not only are you not tapping into the gifts that they could offer and bring to that table, but you're denying yourselves the opportunity for relationship. And what your friend did, she made the conscious effort to move over, to make space, to pull back the chair so that someone who is not like her could occupy that space at the table where decisions and dialogue are happening. Y eso es tan importante. Y los que tenemos el privilegio de estar en posiciones de poder y hacer decisiones, tenemos que hacer espacio para los demás, mujeres, jóvenes, otras voces, Latinos. So it takes work to change hearts.
I do think I was thinking about that as you're both talking too, that we have a tendency to refer to these issues. And also what I love is like, we're not even to the music making yet. This is important to know people's stories because these are all the things that are underneath all of what we see happen on the weekend at Sunday liturgies or in choir practices. There's all these different perspectives that are also true and real and a part of the perspective each time that we gather. We have a tendency to talk about language and culture as a barrier. And I wonder if we even like push to like flip even the understanding of how we classify language and culture instead of being a barrier. What would happen if we instead perceived language and culture as a gateway into, I think, that broader picture that we're trying to create through as a thread through all of these webinars that we've voiced, in a number of different ways, but basically like to know God better as each of us in our own distinct, situation and language and upbringing are each made in the image and likeness of God. What are we depriving of ourselves of when we think of culture or language as a barrier, as a other than, as a over there, as a 1 p.m. on Sunday instead of 9 a.m. on Sunday, we're all at a loss when we continue to think of these things as being compartmentalized and too difficult or messy to actually wrestle with on a regular basis. I know, Peter, we talk about that table imagery a lot, and one of the things we talk about is, yeah, we do have to make room at the table and intentionally do it, and yeah, it probably means that somebody who's expecting to have a seat, who's had a seat for the last 50 years, is maybe not going to have a seat anymore. But also, like, there's also another reality that there's another table. There's another table having the conversation that we think is not being had, and we're just not paying attention to that.
Rufino,
I think,
go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I think, speaking of acceptance, recognition, and inclusion, it's very important that this comes from the top. That is the main thing I wanted to highlight. It's not just the responsibility of the music ministers themselves or the music director, but when we are at a parish, this needs to start at the top with our clergy, with our pastor. And sometimes we start dividing our communities, not just by the language, but by the labels we're putting on groups and on people. How often do we hear the choir of such and such parish? Who's that choir? It's usually, the choir of the dominant culture that's at this particular time, but we're not thinking about all the other ensembles we have at our parish. I actually had a very interesting interaction with a colleague of mine not too long ago because he is a director of music ministries. He's in a multicultural parish, lots of Hispanics in a very large African community that he's serving, plus the Anglo community, of course. This parish has gone through a big transition of leadership where the new leader is definitely very animate about all the leaders in this parish, all the directors, etc., being able to attend to the needs of all these communities, all these diverse communities, not just the Anglos, but the Hispanics, the Africans, etc. So one of the things he said to me is, I am learning how to truly be a director of music ministries. Because he said, for the longest, I thought that being the director of music ministries is just to minister to my choir that I'm in charge for, that I conduct. But I never had any contact or any communication with my Spanish choirs or my African choir or etc. He said, I know who the leaders are. That has been the extent of my interaction and communications. I never know what they're doing musically. I don't know their music. So he said, part of this task is to start learning about who they are, learning about how they worship, learning about their music repertoire, their styles, what is the proper way to do, to sing this music, to play this music, because now he said we're encountering the challenge that we all are called to come together for Triduum, for Christmas. And he said, that's something that's never happened here. And he said, I even had to change the way I talk about my music ministry, that I talk about my music program, because he said, for the longest, we've talked about the choir of my church being this English choir that's it's called the traditional choir that sings at this particular time. So he said, anytime people say, we need the choir of this church to come and provide music for this mass or minister for this mass, he said, we know they're talking about them, but we never acknowledge that it could be the Spanish choir or the, I don't know, the gospel choir or the African choir, etc. So I thought that was a very interesting conversation with his colleague, because he said, I'm having to relearn the way I approach, the way I even talk and refer to other groups in my parish, so that they understand that we're all equally important, that we all need to be at the table. So I think that needs to come from the top as well. And, not just with the labels, not just with our language, and also the resources, right? How many times we see that this is not always fair on both ends. Financially speaking, what are the opportunities for formation that we're giving to our Hispanic music ministers or people that are not from the dominant culture? I mean, I think all those things need to be considered.
Let's talk about that. I mean, that's something that needs to be talked about. First off, both of you have described situations where the bridge building began with persons on either side of the bridge finding that cultural mentor. And I give acknowledgement to Rufino Zaragoza, in his wonderful articles on cultural bridge building and finding a cultural mentor. The fact of the matter is that if you're a music director and you're in charge, your purview is this entire parish music program, but you have little to no communication with the Hispanic choir, that's a problem. But it's also hard to just say, get to it and do it, because how do you start? Where do you make those first steps? And so one of those first steps is indeed that. It's finding a cultural mentor, someone that can be that bridge builder to engage you, to say, here, I'd like to introduce you to this person. He's going to sit in, she's going to sit in on our rehearsal, and vice versa. Este es el director de música y de nuestra parroquia, nunca ha estado en nuestro ensayo, pero ahora va a estar con nosotros para aprender de lo que hacemos, to learn from our gifts. And so, and that whole notion of here to learn. And the other thing is that, Andrea, earlier you had said something of, you feel like when you come to these liturgies that are very multilingual or bicultural, that you have to give up a part of yourself in order to do this. And there is a certain reality to that. There's like that fear, and it happens on both sides. There's that notion of, why am I going to bilingual liturgy because I feel like I'm only getting half of what I normally get, that kind of thing. But I think nuestro tocayo, quien está con nosotros aquí, he gives a great reminder of Christ's outpouring of himself, and that we too are called to follow that same model. And in the outpouring, then we find the wholeness and the richness of the entire body of Christ. And so it's just like falling in love when you give of yourself, in ways that make no sense, but it's for love, and you get something in return, and you find that completeness. And so there's a notion that you can find the harmony and the richness that can be brought that otherwise you wouldn't have experienced. So talking about finances, I think that section, and we should do our part to share that section on leadership and formation in Sing to the Lord, Cantemos al Señor, with our Hispanic choirs and with our pastors, because it states so much in there, and it's sad that the state of our investing in Spanish choirs and the formation thereof is so low. It's negligible, laughable almost. And so, a Hispanic choir, if they don't necessarily read by notes, well, what resources are we providing them to be able to learn by ear or to model, in that regard? And are we saying you're responsible for paying out of pocket, for your sound system, for your equipment, for your resources, for the very things that are responsible, that you're in charge of, for completing and exercising your ministry? And so that investment is critical, and we have a long way to go, including formations like maybe Damaris, you could mention Amphi coming up, and the Hispanic musicians Pastoral Musicians Conference, APMC. We have opportunities available for our people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, based on the need for the Hispanic pastoral musicians, and at that point, you know, I was in the East Coast, and really inspired by Mary Frances Reza initiative in the Southwest with the Hispanic Pastoral Musicians Conference. And we were hungry, the East Coast they were hungry, looking for resources, ways to get formation. And not everyone has the ability or the money to travel and to go to, you know, to the opposite side of the country to do that. So that's how Amphi came, you know, it was developed, you know, based on the need of the people, the pastoral musicians in the Hispanic community. And also, but like you said, Peter, working at the Archdiocesan level and diocesan level, you know, honestly, all my life at this point, I was able to really embrace that need in a very different way, and to bring awareness even to the clergy, to you know, to the up, you know, level, the upper levels, you know, because sometimes they don't have the ways, the tools, or the experience, you know, and we're called to walk with them and to mentor them too. So that's how that opportunity came up with Amphi. So I spoke with the Vicar General. I said, okay, can we do this for the first time here in the diocese? And that was the first encounter, and he was open to that. So that's how we started it, based on the need of the people. And that's coming up. I'm going to mention it before I forget. That's August 27th to the 30th. And it's going to be a virtual conference of formation, and it's totally free. It's totally free, no cost for that. So we will be happy to share that information with, you know, Peter.
Yeah.
We'll share that in the links. For you know, Amphi is the East Coast Pastoral Musicians Conference that Damaris started many years ago and has been running biannually, and whose main purpose was to serve musicians along the eastern coast. There's a similar organization sponsored by the Southwest Liturgical Conference, and that's the Hispanic Pastoral Musicians Conference, which also takes place every other year. These are opportunities, and if your Hispanic choirs are not paid, which most likely they are not, at the very least, a parish could invest in their formation by sending them to an opportunity like this. They're wonderful, wonderful experiences. Or other ideas. If you're a music reading music director, have a weekly class with the Hispanic choir teaching basic music notation. I mean, my job is to create this. See this? Tons of music, but it serves absolutely nothing if folks cannot read the notes. And part of it is simply not, my responsibility is not just producing a book and putting it in the choir or the hymnal rack in the church, but also then equipping people with the tools of how to use it. And so that's one effort. And then I also think it's very important, you know, to work with music readers to start thinking beyond notes, and to hear songs and to learn them, you know, free of music notation, just as a Hispanic choir would typically be doing. And you learn a lot about your musicality that way, you know, when you free yourselves from notes. So, I mean, my responsibility is certainly in the chair that I sit, but even you at the diocesan level and you out there who are parish music directors, there's gifts to be shared. And imagine if you don't currently have the ability to be able to pick up a guitar and just sing a tune and change the key, for that matter, you know, and sing it in another, you know, without having to worry about, oh, I'm in 5 flats or 3 sharps or anything like that. I mean, there's wondrous gifts to be shared, and that's just the very basic of them. But it goes to resources and equipping and upholding, you know, the people who give of themselves week in and week out selflessly.
And Peter, may I add something quick? I need to share this little thing because it was so fruitful for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. I will never forget that music education program that was really after school program at the Catholic Institute of Formation. And that was a great tool, a great way to bring pastoral musicians or new people to learn. But not only that, that opened the doors to create this relationship with different ethnic groups and different ecumenical. It became ecumenical, it became very ethnical. So it was very beautiful. We had people from different cultures, and some of them were really converted to the Catholic Church, because that beautiful relationship through recitals, the relationship with parents, it became a family. So it was not intended to be that. We were offering something for the younger generations, or after school music education, but it became a very, very good way to provide that formation and to transform that into so many possibilities. So it's, like you said, it's very important to invest. We're not spending, we are investing for something that is going to bring a lot of great fruits. So that's all. Thank you.
I think as we wind up our time here together, which I'm very sad about, I wish we could talk for 3 more hours together, because I get so much life out of the group here. But I wanted to make sure to go back to this idea that we came to in our planning meeting together, which is the language of cariño, which I think is one of the most valuable things that the Spanish-speaking community has taught to me, that I carry with me. So Peter, did you want to explain a little bit about how we got there in our planning meeting and what we might take away?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if there's a good way to wrap things up in this, it's that, and especially Latinos who are listening in the group, you know this very well, that notion that we have to be next to each other. I think that's why COVID is just so disconcerting, because it's impossible to stay away from each other. But you know, el abrazo, el beso, I mean, that's all part of who we are, that touch, that embrace, that closeness. And that has to do with carne. Carne is meat, flesh. It's you know, it's the incarnation of that expression of love. And so cariño, as a derivative, or at least related in terms of linguistically to that word, cariño has to do with being present, and being engaged, being in contact with one another. So, you know, especially as dominant culture, Anglo, you know, we gravitate toward email, toward communications that are separated. But this notion that, you know, the Hispanic community thrives, it demands, it begs, you know, this notion of personal engagement. And so in all that we do, you know, it has to be done imbued with a sense of cariño, and that care then drives us, you know, to make the better choices, and to make the space, and to make the investment, and to find the cultural mentor, and to share stories, and to learn from one another, and benefit from each other's gifts. So it's that notion of enfleshment of your care. It's a physical manifestation of that concept. And so I think cariño sums up who we are and where we need to go forward to continue serving our Hispanic church.
Yeah, Andrea.
Definitivamente, Peter. Somos una cultura que realmente valora mucho el contacto personal, ¿no es cierto? A veces pensamos que con un correo electrónico ya hemos hecho el trabajo de invitar, de acercarnos, y pues muchas veces sí escuchamos el comentario de que no, es que los miembros de la comunidad hispana sí se les envió un correo, una invitación, pero no vinieron. Es que no estamos haciendo un contacto a nivel personal, ¿no es cierto? No estamos realmente teniendo ese contacto cara a cara que la cultura realmente aprecia tanto, ¿no? A la que realmente responde. And I think when we talk also about resources, we need to remember that too. How are we approaching things when we are putting resources together, or we are providing informational opportunities? ¿Cuánto cariño le estamos poniendo a eso? cuánto cariño le estamos poniendo al proceso de contactarnos e invitar a la comunidad. Are we really applying cariño, right? When we're in the middle of our outreach process, when we are putting together conferences, workshops, conventions, how much of that is included in the process of reaching out to the Hispanic community? Y lo último que quiero añadir es que eso es algo muy importante que tomar en cuenta el momento de contactarnos, ¿no es cierto? De establecer conexiones con la comunidad, pero también tomar en cuenta la realidad de los hispanos, por lo menos de la mayoría de los hispanos, ministros de música que están acá en los Estados Unidos, ¿no? La realidad económica, también en cuanto a las habilidades, debemos adaptarnos a las necesidades, no solo en un contexto de habilidades, pero a las necesidades culturales, ¿no es cierto? It's important that we remember that, for example, just providing a translation, as friendly as that might seem, you know, if we're translating a document, if we're translating a resource, as great as it might seem, it may actually not serve the needs of the Hispanic community. So we need to adapt to the cultural reality, the financial realities, and also the skill level if we're addressing, you know, practical skills or things like that. And of course, everything has to be done, like Peter was saying, con cariño, ¿no? And acknowledging that even among Hispanics, we are different. There's not just one model that serves everybody, right? What serves our Mexican community might not really serve our community from the Caribbean. And those same things might not serve the Hispanic community from South America. There are differences. So I think it's important that we all recognize those differences, that we're ready to serve the different needs, depending on the cultural differences, even among the Hispanics. And above all, like that we do it with lots of cariño y reconocimiento, los unos de los otros, y aceptación.
And I think it would be good to, even on that note, Andrea, we need several more hours of this. I would love to reconvene this group at a future time. We have so many more things to discuss. I mean, the gifts and the richness and the concerns are something that we're all very passionate about and have much wisdom and experience to bring to the table. So those of you tuning in today, I hope you've enjoyed, you know, this hour or so's worth of discussion. But I feel compelled to, you know, to keep going, and hopefully we'll have that opportunity in the future. I do want to mention that tomorrow, as part of the summer series, we'll be having a discussion on Hispanic music styles. And this speaks a little bit to what Andrea was saying. Simply the mere presence of Spanish doesn't necessarily satisfy the need for a cross-cultural connection. It has to do with how music speaks. And a lot of it has to do with how it's rendered stylistically. And so for anyone tuning in who wants to have a little preliminary tour into Hispanic styles, there's a workshop that's airing as of this evening on Hispanic styles. You're free to check that out. It's on the GIA Facebook page. And then at 1 p.m. Central tomorrow, I will be available here on a webinar to actually discuss that further. And so if any conversation is to be had around styles and you have questions to ask, or things that I didn't necessarily have time to get to in the session, but you'd like to explore more, certainly feel free to tune in. I look forward to that conversation tomorrow to kind of look into the nuts and bolts of how the musical styles are put together. So looking forward to that. Kate, do you have anything else to mention in terms of the rest of the offerings coming up and where we go?
Yeah, stay tuned to hear more about Peter's presentation on musical styles, and join tomorrow to do a little Q&A with Peter. You get him all to yourself, so let him have it. Don't let him get off easy. And Friday, we've got another presentation with Gabe Huck and Alice Parker, which is sure to be another one. The wisdom of those two is endless. So I'm looking forward to that one on Friday too. I do hope that you'll join us again, Damaris and Andrea, for another continuation of this conversation. And I'm just so grateful for the three of you. and the wisdom that you so freely and eloquently share, and that is pouring forth from you. I'm grateful to share the time with you, and just for your generosity and grace along the way. So muchísimas gracias a todos, y thank you all for joining us today. Go ahead and watch for this to premiere live on Facebook again, I think tomorrow, probably sometime soon.
And if I'm not mistaken, there's usually a follow-up email that's sent with additional resource and links. So like the music reading book that's mentioned here in the chat, and other good resources for you will be followed up in that email. So de mi parte, muchísimas gracias. Qué honor estar con todos ustedes, y especialmente Damaris y Andrea. Ustedes son excelentísimas, fabulosas. Estamos muy admirados de todo lo que hacen y ofrecen ustedes a nuestra iglesia. Muy agradecido.
Muchas gracias.